Good evening, class. And good evening, and this evening we are going to discuss a project that is twofold in nature, and that is transcription and also the subject matter of the North Carolina Railroad back in the 1880s. So the ideology behind this project is to show a congruent pattern of Western migration and overall expansion within the state of North Carolina, as well as throughout some of the southeastern United States at times, possibly. But this will be done by way of transcription analysis, which was originally covered in week 4, at which point I selectively viewed and transcribed 3 different primary source documents relating to the history of the railroad in the state of North Carolina, and focusing primarily on the state of affairs during the mid to late 1800s. So within this video broadcast assignment, I will be revisiting these selected documents and postulating the state of affairs during their respective time frames. And the beginning, we have a document called The Proceedings of the Stockholders of the North Carolina Railroad Company. This is from 1884, and so I'm going to read some of the transcription as follows. The Proceedings, Hillsborough, North Carolina, July 10th, 1884. On the motion of T.M. Holt, first time mentioned, Mr. Eugene Moorhead, first time mentioned, of Durham, was made chairman, and D.C. Parks, first time mentioned, and J.C. Webb, first time mentioned, secretaries, respectively. The Committee on Proxies reports as follows. The number of stockholders represented in person 6, by proxy 130, whole number of shares by individuals 10,000, whole numbers represented in person 1,316, and by proxy 5,768. Total numbers of shares reported 7,084. The report was adopted. Now, I'm not going to read the entirety of this document because the language is somewhat dry, and the subject matter itself, while relevant to that particular time, can be overlooked at this time. I will try to include this document within the project that I'm uploading this evening. So the document proceedings from the Hillsborough, North Carolina, July 10th, 1884 proceedings of the stockholders of the North Carolina Railroad Company. So it's worth noting that by the late 19th century, the North Carolina economy had begun to develop into a manufacturing state based primarily upon textile mills and cigarette production. By the time of the 1880s, the rise of production and the consumption of cigarettes had become considerable and was based largely out of Winston-Salem in terms of the cigarette production. Also, cotton mills had become a mainstay in the Piedmont area of the state. And while the document itself is not particularly obtuse or the language is not historically imposing, it is helpful to have the process of historical transcription to understand some of the key players and their sequence within the course of events within this document. So you can follow the liturgy in terms of who is mentioned when, and I think the primary technique of transcription allows you to understand when someone is mentioned and to what extent within the document, and that was illustrated within this particular piece. The next piece that we have was from the Railroad Company of Western North Carolina, the annual proceedings of the Western North Carolina Railroad Company with report of officers. And it proceeds as follows. Thus we find the whole line to the French Broad River under contract with every assurance that we are soon to gladden the hearts of our friends beyond the mountains with the shrill whistle of the locomotive. Believing it injudicious to sell the state securities at the market rates, we have borrowed money, placing the bonds as collateral securities, confident then that the necessity which soon be apparent of paying the interest on the public debt, and knowing that as soon as such action was taken by our state authorities, the bonds would rapidly increase in value. I rejoice to tell you that our hopes are being realized, and that the success and early completion of your road is now secure. And it is due for me to say of the late convention of the late General Assembly that they met all my recommendations touching your interest in a spirit worthy of praise. By their wise legislation, for that purpose, we see the bonds rapidly advancing from 50 cents when they began to now over 70, and as soon as actual payment of interest takes place, we may look for higher figures to obtain. Already, the appreciation of the bonds we hold is over $4,000. Good faith demands that the state should pay her interest. It is equally clear it should be done as a matter of policy. This is an excerpt from a larger document which would take a considerable amount of time to read, but it is very interesting, and we will get into why this is interesting when we cover the next piece, which we will get to in a minute. But the annual proceedings from the Western North Carolina Railroad of 1868, and this was during the late 1860s, and the state at that time of North Carolina was in what some would consider to be a tumultuous state of affairs. This was during the period of Reconstruction process, and it was following the Civil War. And in the year of 1868, the new Constitutional Convention of North Carolina gave the state a new government, which protected the rights of the freed African Americans, thus admitting North Carolina back into the Union. So, as you can see from the transcription of this particular document, the state was ripe for expansionism at that particular time. Now, that's not to say that it would happen automatically, because as we all know, or as we've heard, the period of Reconstruction was fraught with certain inadequacies. And so to say that the railroad itself would bring unity both to North Carolina and to the Southeast, and to reconnect to the North, and it didn't happen automatically, but it would be judicious to say that the North Carolina Railroad and the greater Southeastern Railroad system was quite helpful to that end. The next document that we're going to cover briefly is the Northwestern North Carolina Railroad Company. It's a $1,000 gold bond. And this particular language is very difficult to decipher, simply because the writing on bonds in general is spidery. And so I read what I could, and so as follows: the Northwestern North Carolina Railroad Company is $1,000, and it says principal and interest guaranteed by the Richmond and Danville Railroad Company. Know all men by their presence, the Northwestern North Carolina Railroad Company is indebted to the Central Trust Company of New York, or bears in the sum of $1,000, which sum aforementioned the said Northwestern North Carolina Railroad Company promises to pay in gold coin to the United States. And from this point, the writing on this particular instrument becomes obscure and illegible, at least to my eyes. There may be technology out there that can decipher it better than I have, but I haven't had the time to delve into that just yet. I would like to in the near future. So, back in 1868, a considerable scandal had negative impact on the railroad securities trade within North Carolina, when the Western North Carolina Railroad Company had amassed a significant debt and likewise participated in fraudulent stock subscriptions, as well as the release of fake securities. However, at a later time, which was where this bond was from, which I believe was in the 1880s, bonds had once again begun to be issued with the revenue building for westward expansion. Now, earlier we had mentioned the high hopes postulated by the Western North Carolina Railroad Company and their altruistic language, talking of the people in the mountains connecting with the people in other parts of the state, and that's all very well and good, but they weren't minding their P's and Q's in terms of business. And this was easily deduced if you had taken the time to read through the transcriptions. And once again, transcribing of this particular document does make the reading easier. While these are not Middle English documents, some of them tend to be a little worn in places, so it's best that someone has taken the time to transcribe them. And through the transcription process, we have gleaned some of the state of affairs of the railroad and expansionism in North Carolina, at least back in the 1880s. So that's my presentation for the evening, and I hope that you all are well. Thank you.